Well, welcome everyone, Timberline community. I am really excited because we are joined by Dr. Ron Welch today. And just to kind of give you a bit of an introduction, some of you know Dr. Welch quite well. He is a clinical psychologist. He's been practicing for about a quarter of a century in that area. He's also on the faculty down at Denver Seminary, which is where I studied. And so I have some kind of connections there with him. But we as a pastoral team, a couple years ago actually invited Dr. Welch up to come and speak to our staff. And he was so gracious just to take a couple hours and spoke to us as pastors and said, here are some things that you need to be aware of, things that are going on in your congregation. And it was just such a great connection that soon after we invited Dr. Welch and his wife to come up and do kind of a marriage weekend with all of our congregations. So it was a Friday night and Saturday afternoon, really super helpful. So much so that when Pastor Steve Harris had his marriage retreat, where was that, Dr. Welch? Somewhere up in the mountains.
Up at Steamboat, I believe.
Steamboat, that's right. And invited them to come up and kind of did a marriage intensive for a number of couples up there. So you're not a complete stranger to Timberline community, and we're really excited to have you give us some ideas here today. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So you're an author, you're a clinical psychologist. In fact, your most recent book, in fact, I've got it right here, is of course it's backwards because of how we're doing this, but it's 10 choices successful couples make. And the subtitle is The Secret to Love That Lasts a Lifetime. It's a wonderful resource. Your first book was it A Controlling Husband? Was that the name of it?
That's correct.
Okay. Both fantastic resources. So here's what I thought we could do today, Dr. Welch, is first I would love to have you speak to us, our community, in regard to thinking about living in a new way. A lot of us are cooped up in our homes. That can tend to create maybe even some more stress than normal on relationships. What would you say, first of all, let me maybe kick it off this way. I just had a phone conversation with a woman earlier today, and she said, I realize that I'm watching media constantly. It's my constant diet. What does that create in people during this time? And what would you say to those who find themselves in that place?
I think it feels almost like you're re-experiencing the trauma every day. If you remember back to 9/11, kids would talk about, they would see the videos of 9/11 and they would think it was happening again, and then again the next day. And that's kind of what the media coverage does. When you see things like death toll counts climbing up, and you try to think, okay, the day is measured by how many people have passed away that day. That's probably not a healthy kind of experience. And I don't think that gets measured very often against all the neighbors that are helping out their neighbors and the people that are mowing other people's lawns and bringing meals and all the really wonderful good stuff. That doesn't seem to make the 5 o'clock news, unfortunately.
Very true. So would you suggest it might be good for people to maybe in the morning or in the evening, maybe they have their time of collecting the news of what's going on, but that's scheduled, and maybe they're not just receiving a steady diet of it continually?
Not only that, but I think you need to consider where your sources of media come from. Are you including like the 4 o'clock good news broadcast, or a show that talks about stuff that's going well in the world, and are you balancing what you're hearing so that you're not just focusing on the major news story of the day? That was true long before this crisis came along. News media just don't hit all the good stuff in life all that often. So I'm afraid I've taken to being very devoted to certain news feeds, certain places that talk about what are the things that are happening in the world that are really relevant, what are the things that are relevant to my faith, what I believe, to my family, to my occupation, and not just always think that general news outlets are the best place to hear information. So it's not just how much, it's where and what you're listening to.
So a trusted source is important.
I think so, and it's hard. I remember back in the day, Walter Cronkite's voice would be heard, and people thought, well, we could trust Walter Cronkite. And now it's sort of like everyone seems to have a little different bent or take on how they present what used to be called news. I think now it's a lot more opinion from different people. So I think you have to try to make sense of what the bias is of whoever's presenting that information, and just make sure you have a good balanced view of people that you feel you can trust.
Yeah. I had a Zoom call meeting with some of our small group leaders last week, I think it was, and some of them are single, some of them are married. One of the married couples said, I asked just, how are you guys doing? How are you handling this? And one of the couples said, it's great being locked up with my best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's the norm though, Dr. Welch. What would you say to couples? And there are single people out there and there are couples. So just speaking to married couples or even families, what would you say to those who are having more increased amount of time together? And so just by virtue of that, there is more abrasive moments, difficult times. What are some things that come up when a couple is all of a sudden forced, or a family is forced into more time together than they normally have?
I think there's a couple of things that really start to develop. One is that things that used to be cute or were kind of quirks suddenly grate on you, because they're happening much more often than they did in your life previously. The sources of social support, like your Timberline community, is used to interacting physically and in a close proximity at various times throughout the week. Now those realities don't occur in the same way. So you meet them in a venue like this in a different format, and that doesn't have the same person to person kind of influence as what their normal social support systems would. Friends that they engage in with don't necessarily have as much time or space. So it can become, unfortunately, a competitive environment in the home rather than a cooperative environment. And what I mean by that is people start to fight over scarce resources, like the last potato chip or whatever it is, the last roll of toilet paper. It becomes this competition where people are fighting to get their needs met. And that's true across our world in all sorts of ways. One of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of selflessness or selfishness, unselfish versus selfish. And that whole concept really plays out in the home when kids are there for large periods of time when they wouldn't have been before. And maybe an aunt is in the home, or you could have 7 individuals in a space that usually houses 3 individuals. And what ends up happening is people are arguing more or fighting more to get their way, rather than stepping back and saying, how can I serve these people who are in this household with me today? And if we think about a model of marriage that's based on servanthood and selflessness and being unselfish, seems to work a whole lot better than the kind of secular model that I'm in this for me, and if you don't meet my needs anymore, I'll trade up to somebody else who does. It's a real different approach to relationship, but I think your community will find great benefit from waking up in the morning and thinking, wow, what an opportunity that there's 6 people in this household I can serve today, as compared to who ate the last of the peanut butter.
Yeah. Each one of your chapters in the book starts with I choose.
Mm-hmm.
I choose to, whatever it might be. What role does that play? Because you talked about, hey, waking up in the morning and instead of having this mindset, thinking, how can I? Talk about the role of choice, because I think oftentimes, even, I can oftentimes downplay the role that I have and just react.
Mm-hmm. It's all about attitude and approach, right? And delivery. And if my thought process with my child is, oh man, the teacher didn't do enough today to prepare the homework assignment, and now I got to be the teacher at home, and I've got to do all my work on the computer, and I got to try to deal with meals, and there's so many responsibilities, as opposed to, wow, I get to teach my child today, right? It changes the format and the approach. So if you decide and you choose to interact with your child as an opportunity from God today to hang out with your kid in a way that never would have happened on this particular day, on April 30th or May 15th or whatever day you're thinking of, gosh, it changes the way you approach the interaction. And now it's a gift. It's time you wouldn't have had, as opposed to, I can't believe the teacher didn't do this, or why isn't my kid at school being taught by the people that are paid to teach? Those attitudes, those are choices. You have the ability to change the way you think about these things. And when you change that and you approach it from the standpoint of giving or listening instead of talking, those kinds of things are very, very different in how people then experience you within the household.
So people are experiencing more conflict maybe during this time. In your book, you talk about, you say there's a difference between conflict and fighting. I don't know if I always have a clear distinction between those two. Can you talk a little bit about what is the difference?
Yeah, I have some analogies we may talk about later that kind of clarify that in more detail. But in general, what I'm referring to is a conflict is more of an interaction that's a competitive kind of um, encounter with someone where you're trying to prove your point. Think of it like a couple of attorneys in court, right? Attorneys in court always seem to have an agenda. They want to prove somebody innocent. They want to prove somebody guilty. They want to make a point. They want to prove their case. And when I see couples, when I work with my private practice, I see this all the time. If the agenda is, I'm talking to convince you of how right I am, the other party is already kind of tuning them out. They're thinking of their counter arguments to that. On the other hand, if someone is interacting and just having a discussion and a difference of opinion, and actually it's okay if we agree to disagree. I don't have any dog in the fight. I would just like you to know this is how it felt last night when I was doing the dishes for the fourth night in a row, and you went immediately and were watching your TV show. And by the way, I cooked that night too, and we tried to trade off cooking, but we traded off cooking and I cleaned the dishes, and now I've got a scorecard going, right? As opposed to, I just kind of like to let you know that it'd be awful nice if we could trade off and share this responsibility. That's a whole different approach than an argument or a conflict that involves trying to win. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Now, does that get to, because you also speak about in your book this idea of process over content when working through an issue of, I made dinner and I feel like you didn't appreciate it. What do you mean when you say process is more important in a conflict than content? What does that mean?
This idea actually came from an old show called Everybody Loves Raymond. If you remember that old show with Ray Romano, he and Deborah would have these experiences where they would both be in the same room at the same time in the same discussion, and man, they would remember it night and day different as who was at fault and who was creating things. And so I started realizing, does it really matter if we're arguing about, who left the toilet seat up, or whether the car got washed, or who? The content of the argument doesn't really matter as much as how are we both going to leave feeling afterwards, right? Am I going to encounter my spouse in this engagement, and when we're done, they're going to feel closer to God, closer to me, empowered, listened to, built up, heard? I mean, shoot, it doesn't really matter what the content is. If we walk away feeling uplifted and loved and honored and respected, I focus much more in my work on the process of how people treat each other than the content of what the discussion is about.
Hmm. So what would you say? Let me have you speak to a very specific couple in mind, maybe. If there's someone who maybe feels kind of a sense of hopelessness, maybe they even feel a little bit controlled in the sense of, if I bring this issue up, I know what kind of response I'm gonna get from my spouse. It's gonna turn into a giant fight, and so they just kind of feel hopeless. I'm like, it can't get any better.
Yeah.
What would you say to a couple in that situation?
It's really difficult because there's this concept called learned helplessness that came from Seligman back in the day, when he had the animals would be on an electrical grid, and he'd shock them and they jump and they come back down, and he'd shock them again and they jump and they come back down. This was before PETA protected all the animal rights, but back when we did experiments like that. And eventually the animals would look at the experimenter and just lay down on the electrical grid and say, you can shock me, but you can't make me jump. And the idea is, I'm not stupid here. I've learned this is not a worthwhile pursuit. And so sometimes couples can get in that helpless kind of concept where they think, why would I want to rock the boat tonight? Let's just try to have a calm night. Yes, you hurt my feelings with what you said, but if I bring it up, it's going to be a whole thing, and then we're going to have this argument. So I'll just forget about it. But they still feel hurt, and they still feel uncared for and unloved. And so what I'm talking about to that couple is to say, at least in small doses, can we try to take small actions to make certain we don't accept just the way it is and say, this is the best it's ever going to be? Because then you're kind of settling for a marriage or a family that isn't what it could be. So you kind of have to take small steps. I would encourage in your community at Timberline, I would say, if people say they believe biblical principles of how you should act as a person in any given relationship, then I think it's fine to ask your partner something like, and this isn't confrontational, this is just a question. So you just told me to get up and get you a drink. Help me understand how that matches what we agreed we would do in terms of serving each other. I'm glad to get you a drink, but why did you kind of order me instead of saying, I could get up and get my own drink. Are you going to be going to the kitchen in the next 5 minutes? Because I'd love to have a drink, but I don't want you to have to get. You see the difference? It's the delivery, it's the approach, it's the assumptions. So I think there's something couples who are hopeless can do to start at least trying to change those small steps to make certain that they're not allowing inconsistency between their faith and what they say they believe and how they act.
Hmm. What would you say, just getting real practical?
Sure.
What are some other, because that's a strategy, what might be some other strategies to practice in order to have that healthy conflict? Like, is there a right way to treat your spouse in an argument? And I know there's a wrong way because I've done that.
Yeah, we all learn the hard way, don't we? I mean, we're one trial learners in most of that stuff. I think a lot of it has to do with timing. Like, nothing good ever came of a discussion about a conflict in a marriage after like 9:30 at night. It's just it's too late. People are tired. It doesn't do good to talk about that right before dinner or when you're rushing off to work in the morning. I think that part of this is a matter of deciding if you're going to have times during the week that are set aside for that. So I'm not sure if you were going to ask about this, but one thing that I do talk about in the book is this idea of having 3 marriage moments throughout the week. On Sunday night before the week starts, kind of having a time when you look at the week and say, gosh, what do our planners look like? Do our names even appear in there? With a lot of couples, like, the kids are in there, sports activities are in there, some guy named Frank, the dog, everybody gets in the planner, but our spouses' names don't appear because we haven't reserved time. And so I ask couples to ask each other, when are we going to be married this week? And if they have a scheduled meeting on Sunday to look at the schedule for the week, they have a check-in time sometime during the middle of the week, and they can say, how are things going? Is there anything you wanted to talk about that we might need to check in on? And then some kind of time in the week when they can actually enjoy fun time together. It's kind of a date time, but it's the dinner and a movie thing don't work real well because couples don't even hardly talk during the movie. Can we take a walk together, in this environment we're in now? Can we get out of the house and sit on the back porch and watch the sunset that we haven't seen in 12 years? Some of those things involve making specific choices to set aside time. So when something comes up, it's already built into the schedule that you don't feel like you have to force the issue. And that's what happens in a lot of communication that goes wrong, is feels like we've got to do this now, and it's the only time, we won't get back to it if we don't. So some of those processes are very important to helping conflict discussions go better.
How did you phrase that? You said, when are we going to be married this week?
That's right. Because if you think about it, there's not a lot of time set aside to be married. We schedule, 40 hours for this work thing we do. You and I scheduled an hour to talk with each other. But do we schedule that kind of time at the same priority for the people that we love who are now in this house with us together for extended periods of time?
Wow, that's good. What another thing you talked about, and maybe you can unpack a little bit, because I really like the idea of it, is you call this concept of that we have unspoken truths about the other person.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think they are the belief systems that we start accepting as truth over a period of time as we get to know somebody. So my wife would say, for instance, that I am a very organized person and I can be pretty rigid and want to follow schedules. And so if she just accepts that as an unspoken truth, she may think it's not okay to try and do something different than my schedule. Well, I married someone who's about as different as me as night and day, and so opposites attract, right? And so she kind of thinks, gosh, what would the world look like if we did this today? And I'm thinking, but we don't have a color-coded card for that, right? So somewhere in the middle of that, you learn each other's beliefs and truths. Another one might be, well, he thinks work is more important than me. Now you start seeing how devastating that could be to a relationship. Or he has to, how do I put this? He gets to go play softball whenever he wants, but if I want a night out with the girls, I need to ask him to watch the kids. That's a double standard, but it becomes an unspoken truth. Or something along the lines of, if I want his attention, there are only certain times I can get it. Or she cares more about what the kids need than she does what I need. Those kind of truths have to be brought out in the open, into the light. We have to talk about them. We actually did this in the retreat that we had, that we worked with Timberline, especially some up at Steamboat a couple of years ago. And we had them write down all of these beliefs that they had. What are those unspoken truths you really haven't said to your spouse? And then we had them share those with each other and talk about, do we really want to keep the relationship moving in this direction based on those? So I think it can be very valuable to talk about the unspoken things we believe about each other.
Wow. When you have couples share those unspoken truths, is the other spouse surprised by those much of the time?
Sometimes they're offended. Sometimes they immediately fight back and say, well, that's not what it's not. So I try to ask couples to not be in that competitive mode when they're sharing these things, but just to listen and process and say, this is how the other person experiences you, whether you think that's how you come across or not, right? I don't know how you've experienced me in our interactions over the years, Brent, but I would guess that if I were to allow you to tell me, you would have some assumptions or some thoughts you have about me. And it wouldn't help for me to argue with you about those because you've already decided. I need to listen to you and understand how you're experiencing me so that I can then become more of the kind of guy God wants me to be in our relationship.
Love that. Dr. Welch, thanks so much for taking this time to really speak into the lives of some of our Timberline family. In our next discussion together, first thing I want to ask you is, you have this idea of the Niagara Falls analogy, which I think is so good. I loved that idea. That was so powerful, because I thought, man, I have been there. I have gone too far down the river and found myself going over that. So if you can maybe in our next conversation start off by sharing what you mean by that. Thanks so much for taking this time with Timberline community.
Of course, God bless, and I hope all of you stay safe and well.
Thanks.